Beautiful. We're ready now for our Dvar Torah, and I want to say a word about our Darshan. We have here Fred Lawrence, who has become a regular since we've been virtual. Fred lives in the DC area. He teaches at Georgetown University School of Law. He was the president of Brandeis University and also taught, or I believe maybe was the president. You'll tell me. Sorry, I'm forgetting of George Washington University School of Law, and also taught at Yale Law School. And he and his son Noah have become regulars of our Shabbat morning service since it's become a virtual thing and possible to be anywhere and join us. And he's become part of our community. And when we put out the call for members of the community to be giving drashot, he raised his hand. And what an honor to hear from you this morning, Fred, as you give us your words of Torah. Thank you so much.
Birshut Harav, thank you, Rabbi Timoner, for this great honor. I think we have all found our silver linings during this terrible, challenging, difficult time. And for my family and me, being part of the virtual CBE world since March is definitely one of those great silver linings. To say the very least, this has been a momentous week in the history of our nation. We live 5 miles from the Capitol. On Wednesday afternoon and evening, we could hear the sirens. It was not a concerning time, it was a terrifying time. And I don't mind telling you that I had thought, as I wrote to Rabbi Timoner yesterday, I thought about throwing out this Dvar Torah and starting over again, but I've decided not to. I've decided to stay with the Torah that I had intended to share with you, which has nothing at all to do with the events of this past week, or just possibly everything to do with the events of this past week. We are starting the book of Shemot, which, among other things, has the great moment at the burning bush that we'll come to momentarily, where Moses encounters God, God encounters Moshe. He has his first revelation, and to a certain extent, the entire rest of the Torah is Moses and the revelation that he receives. So I'm thinking now of two of my most profound teachers. One, my first and most important teacher, my mother, whose 14th Yortzeit is tomorrow. The other is my teacher, Rabbi Arnold Jacob Wolf, who taught me one of my favorite stories about Revelation. That's where I'd like to start. Arnold Wolf told the story of, I see a heart go up from Cantor Breitzer, and he has the smile that people have when they think of Arnold Wolf. So you're with me on that. Arnold tells the story early on in his rabbinate. As a young rabbi, a congregant comes rushing into his study and says to him, "Rabbi, I've just seen God." Now, let's be honest. We're thinking, as Arnold was, this guy's off his rocker. I mean, maybe we got a problem here. But then in a split second, he thought to himself, well, no, wait a second. This guy just thought he's seen God. What should he do? He should come see his rabbi. That makes sense. So he just had an instant to decide what's the right thing to say. Do I say, what did he look like? What did she say? What did it smell like? And then it hit him. He had the exact right response. He said, how did it change you? As Arnold taught us, no transformation, no revelation. Today's Parsha has at least 3 moments of transformation, and that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit. The last of which will be Moses at the burning bush, but let's start with the other 2. The first is the transformation from everyday people into heroes, and the heroes I have in mind are the Hebrew midwives. The text tells us that their names are Shifra and Puah. Rashi and the Midrash tells us that it's actually Yocheved and Miriam, Moses' mother and Moses' sister. We learn of the midwives right after the ascension to the throne of a new Pharaoh, the one who knew not Joseph. First thing he does is he sets up the institution of slavery. He sets taskmasters over the Israelites. And the next thing he does himself is to talk to the Hebrew midwives. And interestingly, the text doesn't say Paro, it says Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt. So in case we lose track of who this is, the king of Egypt himself talks to these midwives. He doesn't send some emissary to do it. They must have been terrified. Imagine, here they were hauled into some ancient version of the Oval Office in the presence of the most powerful man in the world. And we know what they were commanded to do. They were commanded to kill every baby boy, to do murder, to do an evil act. The text, from what we can tell, reveals that they didn't even respond. They must have been struck dumb. And yet they feared God, the text tells us, and they did not do what they had been instructed to do by Melech Mitzrayim, by the king of Mitzrayim. They instead saved all of the baby boys as well as the baby girls. And in case we missed the point, the king again calls them in front. And again, it says Melech Mitzrayim. And he said to them, what have you done with this thing? And they make up this crazy story that the Hebrew women give birth too fast, so we couldn't do it in time. We couldn't get there in time. It was a simple, quiet act of courage, a simple, quiet act of bravery, a simple, quiet act of resistance. We too live in a time when ordinary people with everyday jobs have become heroic. The frontline caregivers, the people who deliver things, including essentials like medicine and food. And yes, the people who have job titles that we frankly didn't even know existed before, the members of some election county board committee who quietly acted heroically. In our time, ordinary people confronting extraordinary challenges have become heroic. They have been transformed. Those acts of heroism come from circumstances that they did not seek, but once upon them, they did nothing more but nothing less than the right thing. The second moment of transformation I have in mind is not of one or two people, but of the entire people. This is the moment on which the entire Yetziat Mitzrayim, the entire exodus from Egypt, will hinge. It is the predicate for God's remembering God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah, and the moment at which God enters or re-enters history. We read in verse 24 of chapter 2 that God heard the groaning of the Jewish people, and God remembered God's covenant. We know this verse very well from the Pesach Haggadah. But what caused this particular groaning to reach all the way up to God? After all, hadn't they been enslaved for some time now? Hadn't they been groaning quite a bit now? We learn what makes this groaning different by looking back one verse to verse 23, where we read that it came to pass that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and the cry went up to God by reason of the bondage. The 19th century German Torah commentator Shimshon Raphael Hirsch has a brilliant insight as to why it is so significant that this takes place right after Paro dies and a new king of Egypt rises to the throne. And allow me to share a fairly extended quote from his commentary, because it reads not like it was written in German in the 19th century. It reads as if it were written on the front page of the Washington Post today. Here's what Hirsch says. As long as the initiators of an oppressive state project of such vast proportions as the enslavement of an entire race are still alive, there is hope for an awakening of conscience and the abolition of the injustice. But once an institution, no matter how glaring the injustice that gave rise to it, has passed along with the power of the state into the hands of new authorities who are not aware of its origins and who accept it as traditional, as a legitimate prerogative of the state, the new government will not consider itself authorized to tamper with the time-honored tradition. It will presume that all the institutions of the former regime have been sanctioned by the law of the land. What Hirsch is teaching us is that evil known to be evil can be resisted. Evil normalized is the greatest risk. And so the greatest act of resistance sometimes can be this sheer assertion that what is taking place is not normal, it is not acceptable, and it is most certainly not legitimate. It is precisely at the moment of evil passing into the realm of the normal that our ancestors groaned in a different way. They cried out in a different way, and that is the cry that reached heaven. That is the cry that reached God. That is the cry that persuaded God that the people were ready to be freed, that the people had been transformed. And at that moment is the time for God to re-enter history. After the midwives resisting in order to commit murder, and after the people learning to resist the horrific institution of slavery, our third and final transformation is a quieter one. It involves only one person, Moshe. And it takes place at the far reaches of the wilderness. We read in the first verse of chapter 3 that Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Yitro, and he brought the flock etatzon achar hamidbar, to the far reach of the wilderness, not just in the middle of nowhere, but in the far end of the middle of nowhere. And he came to Har HaElohim, the mountain of God. That is Mount Horeb. That's the same place, of course, that he's going to come back to with all the people when the Torah is going to be revealed at Mount Horeb, also known to us as Har Sinai, as Mount Sinai. We know what happens next well, maybe too well. Sometimes the stories we know too well, we miss the genius of. The angel appears to Moses in the flame in the midst of the bush burns and yet it is not consumed. And Moses famously says, I will turn aside now and see this great sight, why this bush is burned and yet it is not consumed. And it's at that point that God saw, when Moses turned to see the bush, that God reached out to him in the cadence that we now know very well in the prophetic call stories. We read, V'yomer Moshe, Moshe, God says, Moses, Moses, and Moses says, of course, Hineni, I am here. That's it. That's the beginning of it all. The call to Moses that will lead to the exodus from Egypt, that will lead to the receiving of the Torah, that will lead to the entering the promised land, that will lead to all of Jewish history and to a certain extent, all human history. So what happened in that moment at the burning bush on which everything seems to turn? The great Nechama Leibowitz, who perhaps her greatest gift is the ability to ask the unexpected question, asks, why was it a thorn bush, the lowliest of plants? Why wasn't it a sycamore? Why wasn't it some great, giant, impressive tree? Why a thorn bush? She brings several midrashim that help us understand what this curriculum was that God had set for Moshe in the moment of the burning bush. She cites the Mechilta of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, that a thorn bush is easy to get into, but hard to get out of. You can put your hand into a thorn bush very easily, but in pulling it out, it rips and it tears. God was teaching Moses that the work ahead is going to be great. It is going to be hard, and there is going to be violence, and there is going to be tearing. She cites Rashi for the lesson that God will be with us, especially when we're in trouble. God is teaching Moses, you will not be in this alone. And perhaps most poignantly, she cites the midrash of Rabbi Yeshua ben Karba, that the encounter takes place at a lowly bush precisely to teach that there is no place on earth, not even the lowest of places in the middle of nowhere, without the potential for a divine encounter, without the divine presence. Moshe turned to look at that thorn bush precisely because he was learning that one can encounter the divine, the eternal, anywhere, everywhere. How many of us have had the experience during this terrible time that we're living through, of discovering some place you've walked past 1,000 times that suddenly is meaningful to you. Maybe it's a place in the park, maybe it's a place on your block. I will tell you, in our back garden here in Washington, there is a dogwood that candidly I hadn't paid much attention to. It's what got me through this spring, watching it every day. Maybe it's what we mean in the prayer that we read right after the Baruch Hu. And I'll be presumptuous to guess that this one has a special meaning to Rabbi Timoner, because she seems to read it with a special gusto every week, that how much Torah unfolds from each new flower. Or a secular version of it, I suppose, is the great Rilke poem when being confronted with the archaic torso of Apollo and realizing you must change your life. For this powerful experience, Moshe was brought alone to Mount Sinai, to Mount Horeb, the place that had been chosen for him to return as the leader of the people to receive the Torah. Or maybe we have it backwards. Maybe the place hadn't been chosen at all until that moment. Maybe the place becomes chosen to receive the Torah precisely because it was the place in the middle of nowhere, from the lowliest of bushes, that Moshe understood that one could encounter the eternal anywhere with the call that we must change our lives. He allowed it to change him forever. Har Sinai was not preordained. It wasn't a singular burning bush. There are burning bushes everywhere, even in this most challenging of times, especially in this most challenging of times. The question is, do we see them? Because wherever we see them, that is the place where God speaks to us. And that becomes yet another Har Sinai, another Mount Sinai. No transformation, no revelation. May we all find ways to be transformed in our times that will permit us to participate in the transformation of our world, a world so dearly and deeply in need of repair. Shabbat Shalom.